Good morning and welcome to this wonderful program. Today's program is a partnership of the Azrieli Center, the Azrieli Institute for Israel Studies at Concordia University, and the ADATH congregation. We are very pleased to be able to have this partnership again today, especially as we are featuring Professor Csaba Nikolenyi. Professor Nikolenyi has addressed us a number of times. He is not only an expert on the political scene in Israel, but he is someone who is able to explain, to organize, to put into perspective all of the different elements of what is, we all would agree, a very complicated political and social situation. Of course, the situation in which we find ourselves with the new Israeli government is filled with interesting questions, some controversies, both about the people involved as well as by the policies that are being discussed. And of course, is almost always the case, whatever topic we announce usually gets updated by events, in this case, tragic events of just the last couple of days of several terror attacks in Israel. And we really benefit from having someone who is an expert to guide us in these subjects. So I want to express my gratitude to Professor Csaba Nikolenyi for again being willing to be our guest and to explain to us what to make of the new Israeli government. So I'm going to ask Csaba to speak in a moment. If you have any questions or comments, I will ask you to put them in the chat. And then after the presentation, I will discuss with the professor as many of those comments and questions as we were able to do, time allowing. But at this point, it is my great pleasure to present Professor Csaba Nikolenyi.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Whitman, and thank you to the entire leadership at the ADATH community for having me back, though on Zoom. But in this particular case, I have to say that I'm very grateful for the Zoom platform, because as it happens, I came down with something that certainly feels like COVID. I feel just as terrible as I did when I did have COVID, according to my home testers. Right now, my testers show that I'm negative, but I don't believe that. I think that these mutations and strains that are out there probably are not keeping in touch and up to date with the testers that we might have. So I mentioned this as an advance apology for any lack of clarity, maybe a different pace on my part than you might have been used to if you heard me speak before. So I will do my best to make sure that the argument and the data that I would like to present in support of the points that I want to share with you are as clear and as succinct as possible. And once again, thank you, Rabbi Whitman and Stu, for this wonderful opportunity to come together and discuss a very, very topical and very, very important process in the history of the nation, in the history of Israel. So as many of you know, Israel had its last parliamentary election in last fall on November 2nd. And out of that election came a rather interesting outcome. What made the outcome interesting were a couple of things. First, the significant part of the parliamentary opposition, and I'm wording myself carefully, because the previous government that many of us, that the public opinion worldwide knew as the Lapid-Bennett government, that very interesting coalition of 8 political parties, bringing together some of the more radical right-wing political parties in Israel, some of the more radical left-wing political parties in Israel, secular parties, religious parties, and in a historic landmark also, an Arab political party entered an Israeli governing coalition. This government had in the parliament, in the Knesset, what we call a bilateral opposition. In other words, this government was opposed in parliament, not from one ideological position. Often, if a left-wing government is formed, the opposition attacks it from the right wing, and vice versa. But that was not the case of the outgoing government. The Lapid-Bennett government had a bilateral opposition, meaning that it was attacked from the left corner, if you will, those members of the Arab bloc that chose not to enter the governing coalition with Mansour Abbas's Ra'am political party. And on the other hand, the Lapid-Bennett government was also opposed in the Knesset by a much larger and ideologically very homogeneous opposition bloc made up of three main constituencies. The Likud party, the political party of the previous prime minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, two ultra-Orthodox political parties, United Torah Judaism that itself, which is the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, itself made up of two main factions, and Shas, representing the Sephardic stream of ultra-Orthodoxy. So this was the second important bloc within the right-wing pole of the opposition. And the third important bloc was the religious Zionist community, led in the outgoing Knesset, as well as in the electoral campaign by a charismatic leader called Bezalel Smotrich. More about him in the next few minutes. So what was very interesting is that the electoral campaign really didn't feature what one might have expected, a straightforward clash between the government and the opposition. The government itself, the governing coalition, the 8 political parties that made up the outgoing coalition, did not really present a unified program on which they were trying to retain the voters' mandate. And this had repercussions, obviously, on the various collaborations or lack thereof that they tried to build with respect to putting together their electoral lists of candidates. Certainly, there were great divisions within the Arab constituency. For better or worse, the former joint list of Arab parties actually fell apart, and instead of one united Arab voice, one united Arab political grouping running for Knesset representation, there were 3 different fractions and factions running for the Arab vote. So this kind of fragmentation really characterized and described very well sort of the lack of a coordinated campaign on the part of the outgoing coalition. The exact opposite characterized the electoral campaign of the outgoing opposition, the right-wing opposition. Already during the term of the Knesset itself, Likud, the 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, and the religious Zionists, so the right-wing, right religious opposition, constituted a formidable opposition bloc that made the life of the government extremely difficult. On many occasions, the opposition parties actually voted down bills and proposed legislation that the governing parties argued, wait a minute, these are matters of state. These are not matters on which political differences should be driving us apart. Yet, that was not the strategy. Under the leader of the opposition, Mr. Netanyahu, the objective was to bring down the government as soon as possible. It was very cute. Some of you might have noticed that when the transfer in the prime minister's office took place, when Mr. Netanyahu left office and handed over the prime minister's residence to Mr. Bennett, on the prime minister's desk, he left a note saying, "I will be back soon." Now, the same kind of note was exchanged as Mr. Lapid exited the prime minister's residence and Mr. Netanyahu now entered. He finds an almost identical note on the desk back next year, back in 2024. So clearly, these anecdotal exchanges show us and help us see the tremendous depth of the lack of cooperation and collegiality, if you will, and polarization that is going to continue to characterize the relationship between the government, the new government, and the opposition. Now, the electoral results are well known. The four main groups that made up the outgoing right religious opposition came back with an electoral victory. Out of the 120 Knesset seats, Likud, United Torah Judaism, Shas, and the Religious Zionist List, which itself combined three political parties, won a narrow but still convincing enough majority of parliamentary seats, 64, that was certainly sufficient for Mr. Herzog, the president of the state, to invite Mr. Netanyahu to try and form a government, which he did. Now, of course, the government formation process itself was not without its surprising twists and turns. And indeed, while certainly I was one of them, I had many conversations with friends in the shuls and the community in Montreal. But okay, how quickly are we going to have a government after the election? My money was on within 2 weeks. And I was very far from being actually correct. Mr. Netanyahu not only ran out of his 28 days, which any person can have in order to form a government after the election, but he had to request an extension from President Herzog. So within the extended period, he was able to bring together the new governing coalition. But it's very interesting to note that even on the day when the newly formed government was being sworn in on the Knesset vote on December 29th, it was a fascinating day in the Israeli parliament. Those of you who are Israeli politics junkies, luckily, the Knesset is a very transparent institution. All these debates you can find in the Knesset archives. You can watch them ad nauseum. And so after a long day and debates in the Knesset, which lasted well over 5 hours, even in the last moments, it seemed that Mr. Netanyahu may be losing some key members of this coalition. Like everybody was really holding on to their last-minute details and demands with such ferocity and with such insistence. Be that as it may, since the end of December, Israel has now a right religious majority government. The way the government is composed, the number of parties that make it up, the way in which the internal weight and the internal balances within the coalition are distributed, and this is really my central argument today, should be leading us to expect and anticipate that the era of government instability and a real crisis of governability in Israel is now going to be over. In other words, the period when we just cannot get political parties to form a government, the period when governments, even if they have a majority, think of the Netanyahu-Gantz Grand Coalition, which lasted for only 5 months, 6 months, or think of the most recent governing coalition led by Mr. Naftali Bennett and Mr. Yair Lapid, which only lasted a little bit more than a year in office. So this very difficult period of government instability, unstable governments, seems to be over. And I say that because the unity and the homogeneity of this right religious coalition seems to be very strong. I'm going to nuance that in a moment. Likud, for the first time in a long time, has a commanding, pivotal position within a majority that internally, in terms of its values, is the least divided of the various Netanyahu governments that we have seen so far in Israeli political history. So there is much reason to expect that this government is going to bring us some much desired peace in parliament. But friends, if you think that this, what I'm trying to pitch as a return to a normalcy in terms of governability may bring us some quiet in terms of broader Israeli political life, let's think again. Because already we see, and certainly the unfolding daily developments on the streets in Israel, so not so much in the political institutions, but on the Israeli street, what we see is that while the government may be working very effectively, while it may have a solid majority, allowing it to implement some very bold political programs, this may very well come at the cost and at the price of weakened and further weakening social consensus. And if that is the case, unfortunately, we may very well witness and see the same ongoing polarization and unrest on the streets of Israel that unfortunately we have been so accustomed to over the past 3 to 4 years at the very least. The only positive message in all of this is that when it comes to the political institutions, we can expect some return to normalcy, and at least the way in which the institutional feature and aspects of Israeli political life operate will not make sort of the polarization of Israeli society worse off. So let me show you and let me share with you a couple of slides that I prepared to situate the arguments that I would like to, the points that I would like to embellish. The first one has to do with what I mentioned, the distribution of power within the various Likud-led, Netanyahu-led coalition governments that we have seen since the mid-1990s. Now, the proviso that I would like to make to this first slide is that the government that Mr. Netanyahu formed at the end of December is his 6th government. So really, it's only Mr. Ben-Gurion who formed more governments than Mr. Netanyahu, but even so, Netanyahu has been, of course, it's well known in political power, considerably now longer than the founding father of the state, Mr. Ben-Gurion was. This chart wants to stress one important point, and that is that really it's only the 6th Netanyahu government. And let me ask you to look at the green bar chart. So the last green chart, which I'm trying to now use my cursor to point at, and maybe I will actually choose a pen. So if you look at this green bar chart here, it shows us that Likud, having won 32 seats in the last election, actually has now 50% of the seats in the coalition. And this is something that essentially Mr. Netanyahu almost has a majority within the coalition. And that's important because in terms of deciding and setting coalition policy, Likud is more powerful than it has ever been before. Now, some of you might say, but Csaba, if you look at the first Netanyahu government, right, in 1996, we see that Likud was extremely close to that 50% threshold. This is misleading because in 1996, the Likud list actually was a composite of 3 political parties running together, Likud, Gesher, and Tzomer. And within that, the relative size of Likud was even smaller. Likud did that again in the 3rd Netanyahu government when Likud ran together with Avigdor Lieberman's Yisrael Beiteinu. Be that as it may, the big point that I would like to stress here is that in this majority coalition, Likud is in a very powerful position to set the agenda. And that gives a very strong anchoring to the way in which this coalition is expected to operate. Friends, just compare this scenario with the first 6 months of the Lapid-Bennett government, when Mr. Bennett, as prime minister, led one of the smallest parties in that narrow majority coalition government. So naturally, Mr. Bennett was in no position, and his party, Yamina, was in no position to effectively set and steer the agenda of the coalition in a way that him or his voters would have liked. This is not the case here. So we have a very ideologically tight, congruent coalition led by a very strong center-right political party that is Likud. I'm going to mention one other point here, which is actually illustrated by this slide, but just to make a little bit more interaction, I'm going to come out of the screen sharing for a moment. There is one other important aspect of this government that is unique. In terms of the coalition governments that Mr. Netanyahu had led before, whether you think of the first Netanyahu government, second, the third, the fourth, fifth, or until the sixth one, in every single case, Mr. Netanyahu had ideologically much more heterogeneous coalitions to rein in and trying to lead. In particular, one important division that gave him always a very, very difficult headache was that even when he had, as he did between 2015 to 2019, a more right-wing coalition under his command, there was still a very strong secular religious division amongst the political parties that made up that coalition. And friends, it was exactly that secular religious divide that ultimately exploded, that ultimately Mr. Netanyahu was not able to overcome and manage anymore, which created the friction between Mr. Avigdor Lieberman's very strong secular Russian Jewish political party and the ultra-Orthodox political parties. In this coalition, the only secular parties that we have, the only secular voices that we have, all belong to Likud. And Likud, as a party that Mr. Netanyahu very strongly and effectively is controlling. And more about that as we go along. So this is a narrow coalition. It's a coalition that has a majority. It's a coalition that's not divided internally along the secular religious divide. And that really was the divide that always plagued right religious governments in terms of its stability. And Likud is strong in terms of its numerical seat share. So Mr. Netanyahu, for lack of a better word, can sit pretty and wait out the next 4 years, expecting at least in the halls of the Knesset sort of stable times, and he doesn't have to worry about facing the kinds of controversies, the kinds of difficulties that at the end undermine the previous government. Now, of course, not all is good and well with this new government. And now I'm going to point out some of the important controversies that this government had to face and had to own up to. The first one has to do with the very strong decline in the number of female cabinet ministers. Now, certainly compared to the previous government, where a number of political parties that entered the Lapid-Bennett coalition themselves championed the cause of very strong gender-based, the parity representation of men and women, male and female politicians. That is now gone. The only two political parties in the new right religious coalition that actually have female Knesset members and have female ministers in the cabinet are Likud and the religious Zionists. United Torah Judaism and Shas, sort of the ultra-Orthodox, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox parties, never send. It's not in their ideology, and it's not how they think about the role of women in public life to condone the women playing an active role in parliamentary politics or electoral politics. So in a sense, it's not surprising, given the composition of the government, that unfortunately, what seemed to be a very strong upward shift in the number of women at the upper echelons of Israeli political life is now is now being reduced. At the same time, I do want to mention that when it comes to the number of female cabinet ministers that have been in government, in the various Likud governments, we actually don't see a decline. And I'm not saying this to justify or to whitewash Mr. Netanyahu's current government's record of promoting or hindering women's representation in political life. I simply want to stress that the only other time when a Netanyahu-led government had more female cabinet ministers was in the fifth Netanyahu government, when Mr. Netanyahu had to share the coalition and the prime ministership in a rotating sense, which never actually came to realization with Mr. Benny Gantz. But when we compare the current Netanyahu government with all the other Netanyahu governments, we actually don't see a dramatic decline in the number of female cabinet ministers. So what does that mean? That means, and this we actually saw very intensely playing itself out even in the last hours before the investiture of the new government, that Likud and Netanyahu himself was really trying as much as possible to compensate for the lack of female politicians in the ultra-Orthodox parties, to try to bring forward as many within his own political party, Likud, as many women as he could to ministerial positions. Now, that of course meant, and indeed, a number of junior female Likud politicians, Mai Golan certainly comes to mind, but she's not the only one, were advanced to ministerial positions, overcoming and passing over some very established and prominent Likud high-profile politicians. More about them also in a minute. So, friends, please, let's take a note of this important point, that when it comes to the representation of women in this coalition, there is certainly a very important decline. When it comes to female ministers in cabinet, again, I wanted to make sure that we set the record sort of more straight by looking at also previous Netanyahu governments and see that at least as far as he could do, certainly the current prime minister tried rather than not to advance women's participation in political life. Now comes some of the real controversies about the new government. And it's interesting that all of them have to do, or perhaps it follows very strongly from the previous point that I marshaled. They all have to do with men. The first one, and let me go from my left to my right on the screen, is Mr. Aryeh Deri, sort of the old-time member and leader of the Shas, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox political party. Mr. Deri actually retired from electoral and parliamentary politics in the previous Knesset when he was found guilty of tax fraud. You need to remember that Mr. Deri had served a prison sentence before. So this would have been, if he had been sentenced, this would have been not his first, but he would have been found guilty of a repeat offense. In order to make sure that that's not going to happen, he entered into a plea deal. And he promised, and now there are different versions of what exactly he promised, but according to the plea deal, if he retired from political life, he would not be further prosecuted. And that's exactly what happened. He retired from the Knesset, and for a while nothing happened. Except when the next electoral campaign started, Mr. Deri entered as the leader of the Shas political party. And that was important. Why? Because if anyone had a problem with Mr. Deri reneging on his promise to quit political life, somebody should have raised a voice. You can petition the Israeli Central Elections Committee, and people do it all the time. You can petition the Central Elections Committee to seek the disqualification of candidates before the election takes place. So NGOs, political parties who had an issue with Mr. Deri leading Shas could have certainly had the opportunity to raise this issue, but that didn't happen. So Mr. Aryeh Deri argues when he entered the Knesset, the new Knesset, there was nothing preventing him from actually conducting coalitional talks with Mr. Netanyahu, and at the end of the coalition formation talks, accepting 2 ministerial portfolios that Mr. Netanyahu offered to him. These were the Minister of Interior and the Minister of Health. Now, for Mr. Netanyahu to do that, he had to make sure that a new law was passed even before the government was formed, that made it absolutely clear that a person with a suspended prison sentence could be appointed to government. So the new coalition, while the government was not formed yet, the new coalition had a majority. They passed this law. Now there was a law on the books, and which allowed Mr. Derry, who did not serve a prison sentence, it was suspended. So now Derry argued, I have a second reason why I can enter the government. So first, nobody questioned my credentials when I ran for the Knesset, A, and B, now there is a law, the popularly known Arya Dairy law, that the Knesset passed. So now that gives me the right to be in government. And this was a very important issue on which the government, the newly formed government, and the Israeli Supreme Court, or the High Court of Justice, in its capacity as the High Court of Justice, Bagat, actually clashed. Because in a very long, very long ruling, the High Court of Justice, listening and answering the petition that it received from a variety of social actors, ruled that allowing Mr. Derry to be in the government, it wasn't unlawful, it didn't violate any Israeli law, but it was unreasonable in the extreme. More about what it means in a few minutes. Be that as it may, much to a lot of people's expectations, Mr. Netanyahu accepted the court's decision, while he himself didn't like it. He made it very clear. He asked Mr. Derry to step down from government formally. Informally, of course, he keeps sending him invitations to the cabinet meetings, and the other members of the governing coalition also stated that for all intents and purposes, they will treat Mr. Derry as a member of the cabinet, regardless of what the court said. But formally, Mr. Derry is not in government anymore. Now, the other members of the new government, whose appointment raised a lot of eyebrows, are the following individuals. Mr. Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionist political party, which in its previous incarnation, Mr. Naftali Bennett had led. So in fact, Mr. Naftali Bennett and Mr. Bezalel Smotrich, they really represented the more moderate and the more radical versions of religious Zionism that for a while ran together. Eventually they split apart. What made Smotrich's appointment to the cabinet very interesting is that not only was he appointed as Minister of Finance in his own right, but he was also able to negotiate for himself a ministerial role within the Ministry of Defense. So while the Minister of Defense is a Likud politician, Yoav Gallant, within that ministry, Mr. Smotrich has a special role which gives him ministerial oversight over issues that have to do with civilian administration of Israeli life in the West Bank, Yehuda v'Shamron, in the territories. So think of it as Netanyahu taking a slice of the army's continued administrative presence in the Shטחים and giving control over that to Mr. Smotrich. Now, before we might think that this means that the religious Zionists are going to control construction or demolition or the creation of settlements or the demolition of other building projects, Arab building projects, Palestinian building projects in Area C in particular, we should not be so drawn to make quick conclusions, because the first important test case when Netanyahu actually had to side either with Gallant, his Minister of Defense, or Mr. Smotrich just a couple of weeks ago, when a new unrecognized Jewish settlement was erected overnight, soon after the death of the great late Rabbi Drukman Zichrono Livraka, whose death was so dearly, so painfully felt by so many segments of the Israeli political community. But the creation of this new settlement was actually very much using Rabbi Drukman's legacy and memory as a justification. Mr. Netanyahu sided against Mr. Smotrich And he said, no, if the Minister of Defense doesn't condone it, it will not happen. So all that Mr. Smotrich could do was to boycott the next cabinet meetings. But be that as it may, in that confrontation, friends, we can see how important it is that Netanyahu's Likud has such a strong voice, has such a strong weight within this right religious coalition. The next person, looking very animated on the screen in glasses, is Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir was very well known and very highly exposed during the outgoing Knesset for making very strong personal representations at particular flashpoints, and really very difficult areas when Arab and Jewish tensions were flaring up on the Israeli streets. So whether you think of Temple Mount, whether you think of Sheikh Jarrah, whether you think of the various programs that followed the Shomrei Chomot operation, Ben-Gvir established himself as the hero of the various Jewish communities, which often meant that he would pull out a gun, he would also wave it. He was a very firebrand individual, really making a lot of more progressive, liberal Israeli politicians, and more broadly speaking in the Jewish world, very, very uncomfortable. Mr. Itamar Ben-Gvir is a member of this coalition, and he is the Minister of Internal Security. He is in charge of the police. Now, on the one hand, he wants to beef up the Israeli police force. And we know that, and the terrible tragedies that Rabbi Whitman alluded to at the beginning of this talk show us, amongst many other things, the heightened importance of more resources needing to be channeled into the Israeli police. But Mr. Ben-Gvir also made some very problematic statements that suggested that he may want to transform the Israeli police into a more radical religious instrument, an instrument at the behest of religious Zionism. And that was something that made a lot of people extremely worried. Furthermore, his continued visitations to Temple Mount, Har HaBayit, which he can do. Of course, Jews can go to Temple Mount, not to pray, but private visits under restrictive conditions are allowed. If you're a religious person, you may want to ask your rabbi about the halakhic implications of going up to Har HaBayit. Some would not condone. So this is an important religious debate. But Ben-Gvir goes, and he has gone up also since his appointment as a minister. Now, this created a lot of unease, not only within Israel, between the Palestinian and the Arab and the minorities and the Jewish majority, but also internationally. In the Arab world, some of the partners of Israel in the Abraham Accords, certainly Jordan, an older ally of Israel, the Jordanian king, was very concerned about the fact that a member of the government goes up to a religious member of the government goes up to Temple Mount. What was lost in the news reports, it was there, but you really kind of had to pay close attention to this, is that Mr. Ben-Gvir's visit to Temple Mount, since he became a government minister, was really a much lower profile event. He went very quickly, very quietly. The visit was very short. Of course, he still was there. Nothing is hidden from the eyes of social media today, but it seems that Ben-Gvir understands that on the one hand, he needs to show his continued investment in this important program that his constituency feels very dearly about. At the same time, he's a government minister, and he is bound by what the leader of the government, Netanyahu, tells him to do. There was a previous politician, and you might remember Yehuda Glick, who was also a very strong Temple Mount activist, who, when he entered the Knesset, he was not a minister, but he was a member of Knesset. Netanyahu had to tell him, you need to scale down your Temple Mount activism. And he did. So with regard to the fears that we have heard, and the tremendous unease that of course exists with respect to the more radical policies that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir suggest and promise, I think this is where it can become very important that Netanyahu has a strong voice and a very dominant position in the government. Now, the fourth controversial member of this new Israeli government is the gentleman, the last one on the slide, Avi Maoz. Avi Maoz leads, this is the gentleman with the longer beard. He leads a very small political party that ran in the last election on the joint list of the religious Zionist constituency, which was led by Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich. Mr. Avi Maoz's party is called Noam. Now, this member of Knesset has not hidden his lack of respect for communities of Israeli life, that the LGBT community, he has absolutely no tolerance. He has very little tolerance for homosexuality, certainly in public life. And having entered and having become part of the governing coalition, there were great fears that the role that he was given, he's now a minister in the prime minister's office responsible for Jewish content in education, that he may be steering the content of educational programs in Israel in a direction that is very questionable in the 21st century, and certainly very questionable in the broader Jewish diaspora context, but also in the broader Israeli context as well. Now, with respect to Avi Maoz, the important point to bear in mind is that his weight in the coalition is very small. So if Avi Maoz and his party were to leave the coalition, if he were not to get the goodies and the policies that his supporters would like him to realize as a member of this government, he could exit, but the remaining coalition members would still have a majority. So my reading of Netanyahu's handling Avi Maoz is that he, instead of giving him a separate portfolio, he safely positions him within the prime minister's office, where he can keep a very careful watch on him. So these were some of the important controversies to highlight. Now, a couple of important surprises that a number of people expected to see in the new government, but did not make it. And here it's important to explain what it means, what the absence of these individuals means in terms of internal Likud politics, and therefore the internal stability of the party, and therefore the government. The three gentlemen on the left side of the screen, first is Dudu or David Amsalem, a very firebrand leader of the parliamentary opposition in the outgoing Knesset. He ended number 4 in the Likud primaries that put together, that Likud had internal party elections to choose its candidates late. He received the 4th slot, but Netanyahu did not give him a ministership, and Netanyahu didn't even give him a Knesset committee chairmanship. He is too radical. His radicalism, his charisma was great. It was very important when the party and the coalition was in opposition, but now he's too much of a liability. The other two gentlemen, Yuri Edelstein, former Speaker of the Knesset, and Dani Danon, neither of them made it in the top 10 in the Likud primaries, but both of them are very senior established Likud and governmental figures. Yuri Edelstein was former Speaker of the Knesset, former Minister of Health. He challenged Mr. Netanyahu, previously suggesting that he could run against him for party leadership. Now he's paying the price. He is not in government. But he received the chairmanship of the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee. And that is very important. Dani Danon, however, a former representative of Israel at the UN and the former challenger against Mr. Netanyahu for Likud leadership, he is nowhere to be seen. He is a Likud backbencher for all intents and purposes. How long he is going to be content with not having a committee, an important committee role, with not having an important ministerial role, time is going to tell. And the fourth person that a lot of people expected to have a cabinet ministry is Amir Ohana, but instead of becoming a cabinet minister, Mr. Ohana became the Speaker of the Knesset. And what made his appointment very important was that he is the first Speaker of the Knesset who is openly and proudly homosexual. Now, so in terms of sending that message to the gay and the LGBTQ community of Israel, certainly it was very important in Netanyahu's calculation to reduce and ease the otherwise what might be understood and interpreted as a very conservative look and ideological program of this new incoming coalition government. The last point that I would like to share with you before I would turn it over to Rabbi Whitman and the Q&A is a quick look at what this new government actually promised to do and what it has actually done so far. So what I thought to show you is a quick summary or a quick extract from the new government's program. Now, the actual program is about 19 points long. It follows the detailed coalition contracts that Likud signed with each of the coalition partners. And what I wanted to do in particular is to compare this government program with the program of the last more robustly right-wing government that Netanyahu led between 2015 to 2019. So let's see. The very first point in the new government's program is a commitment to increase settlement activity. Increasing Jewish settlements all over Israel, but specifically in Yehuda, Shomron, also increase Jewish settlements in the Galil and in the Negev, areas where the relative size of the Jewish populations have been receding over time, and very importantly also in Ramat HaGolan, in the Golan Heights, there is a very strong commitment to increase the number of Jewish population. What is very interesting, that while Netanyahu's fourth government very explicitly mentioned the commitment to Ribonut, to sovereignty, and work towards that, it's not in the current government's program. So that gives me further indication that this government is more pragmatic. It's certainly very ideological in its composition, but under Netanyahu's watch, I think it's going to be more pragmatic rather than not in terms of entering into projects that that might be creating controversies or that might be too costly relative to the benefits that they might bring. Second very important program has to do with an emphasis on transportation reform. And here the new government is committed to rebuilding or bringing back the Hok Metro or the metro law, which in the outgoing government was championed by Merav Michaeli and also Avigdor Lieberman. So it may very well, under this new government, it may very well see the realization of the light of day. When it comes to the religion and the status quo between religion and state, the new government also puts it very clearly and explicitly that all the changes that were made to the status quo between state and religion under the Lapid-Bennett government, whether you think of the challenges to the authority of the Rabbanut in terms of kosher certification, in terms of Giyur and so forth, this new government wants to turn things back to where they were before. With respect to the peace process, the government program is very explicit about advancing the peace process, but within the framework of the existing peace treaties, so think of Jordan, think of Egypt, and within the framework of the Abraham Accords. Very interesting that there is no mention of deepening talks with the Palestinians. Previously, when you look at Netanyahu's fourth government, before the Corona crisis, that government's program actually talked about working together with the Palestinians, eventually finding some kind of a solution. So we see that this Netanyahu's sixth government clearly sees the solution in the Palestinian-Israeli problem in strengthening the Abraham Accords framework and using that as exerting pressure on the Palestinians to moderating their position towards Israel. We can certainly talk about what the last 2 days and what the terrible, the tragic events of the last few days mean in this regard, but this is important to note. The government continues to be resolutely committed to fight the Iranian nuclear program. The government is very committed to judicial reform to bring about a balanced relationship among parliament, the legislative branch of government, the executive and the judiciary. And I'm sure there will be questions about the judicial reform bill, so I will leave that to the Q&A. If there is a program if there is a policy initiative that has dominated the headlines so far, it is that. And it is that issue more than any of the other ones that turned people out in 3 weeks in a row now, 3 Motzei Shabbat. After the first 2 in larger numbers, yesterday not so large, but still significant, turning out on the streets of Israel. And yesterday we also saw Israeli communities in the diaspora turning out and protesting against the government's judicial reform bill. So bringing that about and reinforcing the Knesset vis-a-vis the courts, so that the court could not overrule government legislation, so that the court could not interfere with the political decisions and choices that the government makes, such as what the Arya dairy decision implied. These are issues that the government wants to change. The government is also committed to strengthening the position of Jerusalem, trying to bring more embassies to Jerusalem, strengthen the unified nature of the capital city. And very importantly, the government is strongly committed to closing the social gaps. And I'm trying to find my screen. Closing the social gaps between the haves and have-nots in Israel in a socioeconomic sense and in a geographic sense, try to reduce the disparities, the socioeconomic disparities between the central regions of the country and the periphery. So in a concluding note, what I would like to say is that it's natural in the life cycle of any government to start out with the most difficult programs early on. You never know what new realities the government or political life might bring. So in a way, it's not surprising that the Netanyahu government pulled out, if you will, the judicial reform bill, probably in terms of domestic politics, the most controversial of all policies in the new government's program, out of the sort of the toolkit at this early point in time. How the judicial reform bill is going to pass, we are going to see this unfold over the next couple of months. The new government is committed to making sure that it's implemented no later than Pesach, so around April. How it will be done, time will tell. On the one hand, the government seems to be very committed to passing the judicial reform bill in its very drastic and draconian version, as we have been seeing it being put forward. And again, if there is interest, we can definitely go into the details in the Q&A. At the same time, it's very important to note that Netanyahu himself made promises to the United States. Simcha Rotman also indicated it in his recent visit in America. And more recently, Yuri Edelstein went on public record arguing that if there is a judicial reform, and there will be one, but it is not going to be passed with a narrow majority. In other words, the government already is indicating its willingness and its desire to work towards a compromise. And in that role, the president of the state, Mr. Yitzhak Herzog, has been playing a very important role in holding consultations, trying to bring the different parties, Mr. Yariv Levin, the Minister of Justice from the government side, and Mr. Yair Lapid from the opposition, to some kind, leader of the opposition, to some kind of a more coordinated, consensual position, so that judicial reform can be passed if it must be, but it if it is, it will be passed in such a way that there will actually be more rather than less consensus around it. Friends, I'm going to stop here, and Rabbi Whitman, with your permission, I would like to turn it over to you to see what questions and in what order we should take the question.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much. That was brilliant. And certainly, just speaking personally, put things in a slightly different perspective for me. I've been following it very carefully, but you have placed it within a context and a perspective that makes it much more easy to grapple with and to understand and to try to relate to. So let me share a few questions that have come up, some of them as you predicted. Here's the first. What is your take on the Supreme Court versus Likud government positions? There appears to be strong ideological divide in the country, and not only amongst politicians. My view, that's the writer, is that there is a need for reform given the Barak legacy. Please.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for asking it, because there was really so much more that I wanted to pack in, and it's great that this is going to be addressed. So in terms of the judicial reform, the key points are as follows. And there are two main versions. There is the reform right now is advanced as a bill represented or put forward by the Knesset Constitutional Law and Justice Committee. That's just which is chaired by a religious Zionist member of Knesset, Simcha Rotman. So the first important point about the judicial reform bill has to do with the power of the Supreme Court to strike down Knesset legislation. Can the court with any majority, should the court with any majority be in a position to strike down a law that the Knesset passed? So right now, the committee majority and the government is working towards what I think is going to be an unsustainable position to actually require that only a unanimously united court should be in a position to strike down a Knesset law. Even critics of the court who are arguing very feverishly for judicial reform argue that this is too crazy. It's very rare. Even on the Arya Dairy decision, the court was not unified. There was no full consensus. So this is an important point, and this is something that I certainly share. I think that if my view is that if the court should have the power to strike down a law that the representative of the people in the Knesset passed, it should be a strong judicial majority, but I would not require unanimity, because that would almost cripple it. Certainly, if you connect it with the second important point, who appoints the judges? Who appoints the judges? Right now, there is a 9-member judicial appointments committee. The majority on this committee are legal professionals, 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association, and 3 members of the court, and the president of the Supreme Court being, of course, one of the 3. Well, that means there's a built-in majority, therefore. And this is exactly what, in terms of judicial selection, the judicial reform process wants to correct. Now, here the argument is, and on the face of it, it's a very nice argument. The governing coalition wants to have parity and perfect balance amongst the 3 branches of government. So keep the 9-member judicial appointments committee. Let there be 3 of these committee members come from the courts, 3 from the government, and 3 from the Knesset. Now, of course, because Israel is a parliamentary system, the Knesset majority and the government majority, so the executive and the legislature, are very closely intertwined. So critics of this proposal argue that if you do this, you essentially give the government that has a majority in the Knesset now the control that currently the lawyers have over the Judicial Appointments Committee. Well, the defense or the counter critic to this is that, well, Israeli governments historically, and this one is no exception, are always coalitional in nature. There are always divisions, right? And so the very coalitional nature of Israeli governments kind of protects against fearing too much of a very solid government bloc that might keeping the lawyers on the judicial appointments in check. In other words, within any Israeli governing coalition, there is always enough division not to have to worry about this too much. But this is important, right? And if you connect the process of judicial selection to the previous point that I mentioned, well, if the politicians have now a majority, if the politicians were to have a majority on the Judicial Appointments Committee, they could start appointing, with this coalition, conservative judges who obviously would take a very different view and look at judicial review of government legislation than what we have been seeing so far. So the two are closely interrelated. Now, truth be told, that you can only achieve a consensus on this issue, I think, if you make the Judicial Appointments Committee, the membership, even in number, so make it 10 or 8, and strike perfect parity between the lawyers and the politicians, because that would take away the edge. You cannot do either the politicians or the judges or the lawyers will have a majority, no matter how you cook this system, if it remains either as it is now, or if the committee changes its composition as it's proposed. So that's my view on that particular issue. The third important element of the judicial reform bill has to do with the so-called override clause. Override clause is the end game. Imagine the Knesset passing a law, the courts striking it down, saying it's against the basic law on human rights and dignity, or the Declaration of Independence, and it's null and void, or pass a new legislation. According to the override clause proposal, now the government argues we should give the power to the Knesset to reject, to override a judicial review with the barest majority, 61 Knesset members. So even again, you start seeing how the government is proposing this a judicial reform bill that is, I mean, this is really an extreme position. A 61 MK, a 61 Knesset member majority is extremely tight. And if you challenge or if you override a negative court decision, and it's important to bear in mind that it's true, the Israeli Supreme Court did strike down Knesset legislation since 1992, since the constitutional revolution started, but it really hasn't over-abused its power. To this day, only 22 laws were struck down. So we're not talking about a situation where the governing program or the legislative program of the government is paralyzed by the court. We really haven't been seeing that. So I think what is much more reasonable to see emerge is that some kind of a qualified majority of the Knesset, which should require any coalition majority to also bring on board some members of the opposition, should be sufficient to challenge the Supreme Court's negative judicial review. So that's what I see on that issue. And the fourth point of the judicial reform proposal has to do with the status of legal advisors. So every government ministry has a legal advisor who plays a very important role in supporting or not the minister's legislative program. When the government wants to propose a government bill, a piece of law that advances the government's legislative program, it has to go through the legal advisors. And the legal advisors ultimately are reporting to the Attorney General. So many government ministers have complained that, certainly right-wing government ministers, that the legal advisors are not allowing them to advance legislation as effectively as they would like. So essentially, they want to do away with the independent position of the legal advisors, and the new bill wants to empower government ministers to essentially bring in a legal advisor who is their political appointee. So we see that it's a comprehensive bill. Now, I would like to make 2 points, and these are 2 points that I myself, they are not, I cannot claim the credit for making them up, but I'm very much taken by these 2 points. Many of you will know from the Montreal community, Moshe Capel was very active. Of course, the family is very well known. Moshe is leading a very important think tank in Jerusalem, the Kohelet Research Institute. Moshe has played a very important role in giving advice and also participating in public debates about this issue. And he points out that there are 2 important principles which are not clarified to this day about the relationship between the Knesset and the Supreme Court. And the lack of clarity on these 2 issues gives the Israeli court, by comparative standards, tremendous clout. One of them is the issue of standing. In the United States, the Supreme Court will hear a case if the party that brings it can demonstrate standing in the matter, that there is a real harm accruing to that party from the problem at hand. That's not the issue here. In the case of Israel, the court can actually hear cases where without any party, without the litigant needing to show that they have standing in the matter. And this, amongst others, actually allows the court to make judgments and decisions about the reasonableness of government decisions, rather than the legality thereof. The second point that Moshe points out, which is not clarified to this day in the Israeli political architecture, has to do with the issue of justiciability. In other words, the range of issues on which the court, it's not for the court to interfere. There was a time in the 1950s and 60s when the Israeli court clearly told the Knesset that we cannot consider political debates justiciable. You cannot expect the court to make a decision about whether it's right to appoint a government minister or not. These are political matters. Fast forward to 2023, the court can publish a 200-page long ruling against Aryeh Deri against Aryeh Deri taking up a ministerial appointment. So the Kohelet Institute and Moshe very succinctly and eloquently argues, even before and in addition to thinking about judicial reform, there are these broader principles that need to be somehow clarified in how the Israeli political system operates. So I hope this is not a cop-out, but at least it allowed me to give a sense both of my view on these issues and also sort of embellish sort of the very complex debates that Israel faces on this issue today.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. The next question is, in view of the Iran situation, is there any chance of a unity government being formed?
Thank you for that question. Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I do like to say that if I had a crystal ball, I would absolutely not see a unity government. I think that it certainly seems that the Iran situation may escalate, but I think that the very fact that this narrower, compact coalition, right religious coalition government was able to fast forward an agreement with the United States and bring together Juniper Oak, like the largest ever joint military exercise between the two armies, including land, air, navy, bombing in the Negev and so forth. The very fact that this government can do this so quickly suggests that there is really no need for a unity coalition. On the issue of the Iran threat, I have no ground to doubt that the current parliamentary opposition would be a very loyal opposition. And we can already see that on a number of security issues. One of the first bills that the new government had passed in the Knesset had to do with the removal of Israeli citizenship from Palestinian residents and citizens who also have Israeli citizenship who commit terror attacks. And this was supported also by quite widely by the opposition, by the Jewish opposition. So on matters of security, I see this opposition, certainly not the former members of the joint list, the Arab constituency, but certainly Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid, certainly the National Union, Camp Benny Gantz and Gideon Sa'ar, Meretz and Avoda less so, but certainly the more center and centrally positioned parliamentary opposition seems to be playing a very loyal role, the role of a loyal opposition. And I don't see how or why that could change, even if we were to have a more severe confrontation with Iran. And I mentioned the Juniper Oak exercise because the Iran issue, because that was really convened with Iran in mind, right? So it wasn't just an abstract exercise. The Iran issue really was the reason. So that's why I think that for some time the unity coalitions, the era of unity coalitions may be over.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I've had conversations with several individuals in the United States who are reevaluating their support for Israel because of the expected right-wing religious policies. Does Israel need to do damage control so as not to erode diaspora support?
Yes, absolutely. It's not a new issue, but it's an issue that will now have to be done ever more urgently and ever more delicately, and it has to be a super top priority for the government. We know this, and of course this is not news, that certainly American Jewry is much more liberal in terms of its political orientation than Israeli Jewry, and certainly than the electoral constituency, the electoral base of this government. So a radical right-wing program, if implemented by this government, is only going to deepen the gap and the divide between American Jewry and the government, and that's not healthy. That's strategically inappropriate and not wise. Now, and I do have to say that this comes up. I've heard this in conversations also from students. I had meetings with students from at McGill a few months ago. At that time, we were only contemplating about we're talking about the prospect of a possibility of a right-wing government. McGill students were sharing with me that, look, professor, if there is a right-wing government in Israel, we have a difficult life on campus. It will be even more difficult. So this is an issue that's acutely felt, and it may be even more acutely felt by many of us. Now, my answer to the friend who asked this question is the same, and I cannot put it any more eloquently, nor would I even try, as what President Herzog said during his first trip to the United States, even before the new government came into office. This question was put to Yitzhak Herzog, and he said, please remember that at the end of the day, this is the only government, whether it's going to be left or right or unity, this is the only government of the only Jewish state that we have. And it is a government that, whether it's left or right, that will come to power through democratic elections. Criticize it if you don't like, engage it if you don't like, but do not confuse your support for the state of Israel with the outcome of the electoral process in the country. Those are two separate. It's not that criticism should not be voiced, must be, but don't take it too far, because the state of Israel, and that's part of the democratic game. Sometimes it throws up outcomes that we like, sometimes it throws up results that we like less. But in the long run, things balance out. And I think that the president of the state of Israel, Mr. Herzog, was absolutely right. So If you're a critic of this new government, engage it, participate, absolutely. And that's why the demonstrations, you cannot ignore them. When 100,000 people turn out week after week, clearly 100,000, that's not a lot in terms of electoral numbers. But in terms of civil unrest, it's significant. It cannot and should not be avoided. And it's very important for the government to hear it and to know it. So I think that pressure is good. It's important because only politicians only respond to that. But I would caution not mistaking this strong support for the state of Israel, which is the only Jewish state, and it is a democratic state. It is both Jewish and democratic, the Dibur Echad, as former President Rivlin used to say, that we have. So if you don't like the current government, engage it democratically. There will be another one. Maybe not in 4 years, but there will be another one that you will like more.
Professor Csaba Nikolenyi, you've gone far over your time in answering all the questions. I appreciate it. On behalf of everyone here, we're very, very grateful to you. On behalf of ADATH, it is wonderful to be together with the Azrieli Institute and to be able to listen to your remarkable, sensible overview of what's going on. And we certainly hope to have you back again in the future. Meanwhile, we want to wish you refuah shlema, feel better soon. But also to everyone who has joined us, thank you very much for joining us. We would love to be able to continue doing this in the future, and we look forward to doing so. Have a wonderful day. I'm Yisrael Chai. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Witten. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.